It is a generation, and specifically it's the generation of these young boys who were still at school, probably in the sixth form, and who were recruited by their teacher to join a war effort with having no sense of what they're really letting themselves in for.
Hello, Carolin.
Hello.
Thank you very much for joining me today for our podcast on Invest Nichts Neues. For today's episode, we want to talk about the narration style and the different forms of communities we see in the novel. But before we dive into all of this, could I ask you to please introduce yourself? Just tell us a bit, what do you do at Oxford? How did you end up here? And maybe also, why do you do German literature as a job?
Yeah, so my name is Carolin Duttlinger. I was born in Germany. And I started my degree in Germany, and then after 3 years I decided I wanted to go abroad. So I came to the UK, I did a master's in Cambridge, and then after that I liked it so much I decided to stay for a PhD, and after that I came to Oxford. And so now I teach German literature at Wadham College. I work quite a lot on this period, so on the early 20th century, especially on the Weimar Republic, so the 2 decades between the end of the First World War and the rise of Nazism. And we used to teach this book as part of our first year syllabus. We keep changing the syllabus, but it was really popular with students because I think it really spoke to them for being a book about young people and their experience of war.
No, absolutely. And before we dive a bit more into all of this, could we maybe talk a bit about technical terms that our audience and our participants can use in their essays when they want to talk about the text? So could we talk a bit about how best to describe the narration style and maybe a few technical terms?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, it's probably important to think a bit about narrative voice and narrative perspective. So when we look at the text, the beginning, we can see that it's told in the first person narrative perspective. So we've got a narrator who is part of the story, namely Paul Bäumer, our protagonist. But what's very interesting is that he doesn't always speak in the first person singular, like using I, but also he uses the first person plural, we. And in fact, the very first word of the novel is wir. So that is very important, that we have a first person personal narrator who is also a character within the novel. The other thing that's maybe worth talking about is verbs and the tenses that he uses to tell his story. So the beginning is in the present tense. Wir liegen 9 Kilometer hinter der Front. So we're 9 kilometers behind the front line. So he uses what we would call the historical present, which is really, it's about recounting what happened in the past, but making it more immediate by using the present tense. And then on the other hand, we have episodes which are like flashbacks, where Paul talks about his time at school and how it happened that he and his friends actually became soldiers. And so those parts are told in the past tense. So that's a sort of narrative past tense or preterite. And so that's quite interesting, the way that the novel shifts between these two different tenses and also shifts between two narrative voices, which is the first person singular and first person plural.
I think that's a really good point. Maybe we can dive into that a little bit with a very clear question, maybe who really speaks in Invest Nichts Neues? Maybe we can just expand on that a bit more.
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually quite a difficult question. And here I'd like to actually bring in another bit of the book, which is the little preface, or it's almost like a dedication. So Remarque starts, in fact, not with the story, but with a little statement. And he says that this book is not meant to be an accusation, nor a confession, so Anklage or Bekenntnis. It is an attempt, as he says, to report, berichten, about a generation that was destroyed by the war, even though it escaped the grenades or survived the grenades. And the key word for me here is generation. And that, I think, gives us a very big clue in terms of who is the we that is being used in the narration. It is a generation, And specifically, it's the generation of these young boys who were still at school, probably in the sixth form, and who were recruited by their teacher to join a war effort with having no sense of what they're really letting themselves in for.
And also no other experience other than school.
Yeah.
It's this idea straight out of school. There is no job, there is no university, it's school and then the front.
That's right. And so in a sense, you could see it as what in German is called a Bildungsroman, so a novel of formation, which is typically a story about a young person experiencing various things in the world, like growing in maturity, going maybe through some sort of trials and tribulations. We could think of David Copperfield, we could think of Wilhelm Meister by Goethe, and coming out the other end, a more mature, grown-up person. And so this idea of a young generation, of these young people undergoing these experiences, obviously it kind of invites us to compare it to this genre. But of course, at the same time, it obviously doesn't work like that.
Yes, we did talk about this in our introduction with Ian, how he also said it's not that, because there is no end point for any of them in this generation. They only know war. That's right. And they don't know what can be at the other end of it. Yes. If we speak about the we and this generation, maybe we can also talk a bit about camaraderie, because I think that is a big part, and that is shown in the we that is used in the novel also, and by Paul as well. What does that mean? What does camaraderie mean in the novel? And how is this maybe also contrasted with the rest of society that are not part of that we?
Yeah, very good question. So I think it's worth adding here that the we is the we of this generation of adolescents, but it is also more than that. So if we look at the core cast of people, we've got 8 soldiers at the beginning. 4 of them are boys from school who know each other. And the other 4, and I think it's very interesting how Remarque sets this up in this symmetrical way, that you've got 4 and 4. The other 4 are older working class men.
Yeah.
So the we then becomes less about age and it becomes about the common soldier. So it becomes about rank. And that, I think, is really important, that the war experience in a sense transcends social class, because the pupils, the students, are presumably all from middle class backgrounds, because they are doing their A-levels, they would have probably gone on to go to university, whereas the 4 older men are all manual workers. There's a farmer and so on. So they represent a very different section of German society, and that's where camaraderie comes in. So camaraderie is this sense of having undergone all of these experiences together and therefore forging a new form of community.
Yeah.
And then, of course, your question, who isn't part of this? I think there's 2 groups who are not part of it. First of all, the civilian population. This is very clear when Paul Bäumer goes, has like goes back home to see his family. So the parents don't really understand what's going on, but more importantly, there's a scene where he goes to the pub and there's all these like older men who think they understand military strategy, and they talk about the war effort, sort of armchair general type people. And those are the people he really gets angry with, because they are not in it like he is, and yet they try to tell him and his fellow soldiers what to do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And they're also the ones that represent the teacher that got them into the war in the first place, who had these ideas about what war is, about what glory is, and all of this. And he then also is being trained, the teacher is being trained by one of Paul's fellow students later, because it's all up on its head in a way. So
that's right. Yeah, Himmelstoß is a very interesting character. I think what we also have to understand is that this is really a book about a very long history in Germany, the history of militarism and the history of nationalism. Yeah. So, of course, the book was published in 1928, but really the society it depicts is the Wilhelmine society that had sort of existed since 1871 with the German unification, this whole idea that German national identity is a military identity, and it's based on battles that Germany won. And so this sort of military identity, the fact that if you had a military rank, you were someone in this society, which we see very strongly in the literature of the late 19th century, especially Theodor Fontane, where characters, male characters, are always defined in terms of their military history. And this is sort of these are the, this is the last chapter in that story of German national identity, which then, of course, will be revived with the Nazis.
Yeah.
But you can see how there's this incredible tension between the old generation who have grown up with this sense of national identity, and then the young generation who are thrown into this war based on this sort of national myth of German greatness.
Yeah, and now have to live it, and the others don't. If we go back to the generation bit, because I think you make a great point how generation in the book is not necessarily defined by age, more by the experience itself. And you've mentioned the quote at the beginning where Remarque says that it's about a generation that was destroyed by war, even though it escaped the shells. How do the characters themselves talk about themselves as a lost generation? Not necessarily, obviously, calling themselves a lost generation, but how do we feel that in the text?
So I think the point is that these boys are plucked out of the schoolroom and plunged into the battlefield, and there's no way to grow there. It's just a matter of survival. So what's quite interesting partially is these battle scenes where they talk about like themselves almost as animals. There's a sort of like survival instinct that kicks in. But looking forward, they are, of course, aware that at some point the war will end. And the older men in their group, they have a perspective. They have families to go back to. So the farmer has a farm he's eager to get back to, and so on. The boys say of themselves, wir sind alte Leute. We are old people. We have aged prematurely. So it's almost this bizarre effect of having been catapulted from youth into old age. They will come back into civilian society as veterans, into a society that won't understand what they've been through, and they will be scarred for life, but coming at this from a place of not even having been fully formed and not really rooted in life. And I think that's a very strong statement, really. So even though we're talking about camaraderie, we're talking about this group of 8 men, there's also a sense that for the young ones, it'll be harder than for the older ones to like find their place again in society.
Yeah, absolutely. If we move to the end, because I think this is quite interesting for the narration of the text. So, spoiler alert for everyone, our first person narrator dies in the end, famously. How is this inherent problem that now the person who's actually narrating the story for us, through whose eyes we are experiencing the story, is actually dead? How is this problem solved? And do you think this changes anything about the perspective of the text, or does it give us like any other insights on the narration style?
I mean, first of all, I think it's a brilliant trick on the author's part, because we really don't expect that. There is, of course, a convention that if someone is telling a story, they live to tell the tale. So they are the survivor. They in a sense carry our hopes for this generation and this group, because of course many of them die, including his best friend Kaczynski, which is a very moving scene. And so it is a rather shocking turn of events, especially, and of course this gets us to the title, the great poignancy that he dies right at the end of the war, on a day when barely anything happens and when the end is in sight. Yes. And I think that is very important. The other thing is, of course, so he basically dies, you could say, in this gap between there's a switch in the narration from the first to the third person. So there's a break. He's basically reflecting on what is to come. He says, I'm very calm. He's thinking ahead. And then there's a break. And then suddenly you have this impersonal voice telling us, fiel im Oktober 1918. And then adding, and this is where the title comes into it, a day which was so quiet that the military report from that day simply says, all quiet on the Western Front. So that's of course, again, a genius move to only explain this rather odd title in the very last paragraph of the book. So I think there's a great poignancy in the way that we have almost an epilogue.
Yes.
So there's this sense of calm, there's this sense of like we've come through the worst, and then of course in the 11th hour he falls. And he doesn't fall in battle, he is killed by a sniper, and there's this sense of peacefulness. So it's a very poignant moment, I think, in a book which spends so much time talking about the brutal side of war and spends a lot of time talking about people dying in great pain in the battlefield. So this is a very different death, but I think it does leave a very bittersweet aftertaste.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the point you made that before he dies, he's thinking ahead, he's calm, he's thinking about the future, as they are all quite reluctant to do until this point, and they're all quite worried about the future because they've just been school kids and now they're soldiers and what's to come, and now he can think about the future. And in that moment he dies. And we, the audience, or we, the readers, know October 1918, he nearly made it, and then he doesn't. And it's this shift in the narration going to the third person, I think, really hammers that home for us as a reader.
I think also what's worth pointing out is this word Heeresbericht, so the military report, which nicely picks up the verb berichten from the little preface.
Yeah.
So he says it's not an accusation, it's not a confession, it's a report. And so that is picked up again here. So it's very calm, it's very factual, it's like a newspaper report perhaps. And it's worth saying that in the 1920s, when the book was written, we have a literary movement called Neue Sachlichkeit, so new objectivity, and that is precisely you could say, the style of writing that emerges in the 1920s, which is factual. It's modeled on journalism rather than, let's say, a more expressionistic, emotional form of storytelling.
Yes, and luckily Ian has told us quite in depth about how Neue Sachlichkeit applies also to the text. So yes, exactly. And I think it's great. It's a full circle moment a bit, because we have this berichten in the very beginning before the actual plot happens, and then we have it at the end again. So yeah, amazing. To finish us off, I would like to ask you a very broad question, and maybe the hardest one I've asked you so far. Why do you think Im Westen nichts Neues is a German classic?
I think it's partially a German classic because of its international resonance. I believe it was translated into over 100 languages. And it's also very interesting when you look at the history of its reception, that the book has actually been banned, even in Germany and Austria, and in many Western countries since it was published, including, for instance, during the Vietnam War. And I think it's a classic because it has such a strong anti-war message. And also because it talks about the war not just from a German, but from an international perspective. So, of course, you've got this crucial scene where Paul Bäumer is in a shell hole together with a dying French soldier. So it's also, I think it's a German classic precisely because it transcends German literature.
And it's about an experience that was quite international as well. And I think a lot of people could relate to, especially at the time.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think that was a brilliant conversation. And I think, we all learned a lot about the structure and the narration style of the text. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.